Welcome to Lunch with Legacy Leaders, a weekly talk show with local and national thought leaders discussing issues impacting the Black community. Now introducing our host, Miss Ann Marie Sorrell.
Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch with Legacy Leaders. I'm your host, Ann Marie Sorrell, President and CEO of the Mosaic Group, Florida's premier advertising and marketing agency. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us this afternoon. We have a very exciting program coming up, but before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors for making this broadcast possible. Thank you to the Messman and Dover Accident Attorneys, AARP, the Florida Lottery, FAMU Mary, and All of Us Research Program at the University of Miami. Now, today I am joined by producers of a very important documentary, Crossing Overtown. So I'm joined by Scott Barnett, who is a producer and director with over 30 years of experience in documentary filmmaking, content creation, and commercial advertising production. And Johanna Vega is the executive producer of Fluxion, I hope I said that right, with an extensive background in film and TV production for over 20 years, and Delrish, who was born in Overtown. He would join the City of Miami Police Department, eventually becoming the public information officer and the voice of the department. Welcome to all of you to Lunch with Legacy Leaders.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you. So what I want to do is start off by, because you all had, pretty interesting biographies, but I always like to have our guests tell us in their own words, briefly, just about your background and, how you got into filmmaking, content, of course, Officer Moss, your background in law enforcement and, what led you to this particular documentary.
All right, you want to go first, Joanne?
Sure. So actually, my background, I was born in Costa Rica, and that's where I did my communication studies. I've been here in Miami for 25 years and dedicate myself not only to production, but I also I like to work in certain groups of Latin women. I have a position in an organization in Broward County, Mujeres Latinas, empowering women. And we do several work with other organizations like United Way and the YWCA. So we do a lot of projects, community projects, and definitely this documentary was a very nice inspiration to keep doing the work we do. And
I'm from Miami myself, a native. Actually, my family goes back to Miami of the 1930s. We had an office supply store called Barnett's Office Supplies. And I got the bug for filmmaking very young, even when I started around 14 in school. Went to the University of Miami, studied film there. Actually, one of the first documentaries I ever worked on was actually on the Midnight Basketball League that was in Overtown. It was a great program that they used to have. My background is also, I studied history, so I'm always interested in the stories of the diverse group of peoples that make up the city of Miami. And so it's always interesting to get perspectives on different people's narratives and their stories in the city.
And wow.
I'm Delrish Moss, and I've been in law enforcement now. This is my 39th year. Having started in 1984 with the City of Miami Police Department and retired from there in 2016, then I was chosen to be the first actual permanent African-American chief of police in Ferguson, Missouri, after the unrest occurred there. And I was charged with putting together a consent decree and bringing the department back together. And I'm currently a captain with the Florida International University Police Department after having spent 3 years in Ferguson. I grew up in Miami, starting in Coconut Grove down to Perrine. A large chunk of my life was spent in Overtown. In fact, when I started with the police department, I was living Overtown and working in Overtown as well. But in terms of telling the story of Miami. I didn't really become interested in the stories of Miami until I had the opportunity to meet two men, Ralph White and Edward Topps Kimball, who were the last two surviving members of the first 5 Black men to be police officers with the city of Miami in 1944. I met them when we did a Black History Month program. They took me to what was then an abandoned building, which was later I later learned it was the precinct. It was the Black precinct for a segregated police department. And so when I started to learn that history, I became really interested in history. So when Scott approached me about this project and telling all those rich stories that I later started to learn, I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to do that. And I'm just humbled to be even thought of enough to be a small part of it.
Wow, that's amazing. And I had an opportunity to do some work in Overtown a few years back with rebranding and creating the Experience Overtown brand. And it was just really interesting to learn about the history and then see the transformation over these last, 10 years or so of Overtown. So kudos. I can't wait to, we're going to dive into this discussion. But before we do, I want to just kind of give a little background about Crossing Overtown. Crossing Overtown examines the integral role Miami would play in the national civil rights movement and the long narrative of racial conflict that still resonates in the national conversation. Overtown is the oldest Black community in Miami, and it will bear witness to the full arc of the civil rights movement. Delrish Moss, a former Miami police officer and a son of Overtown, would eventually carry the lessons of that history to Ferguson, Missouri, become the first African-American chief of a police department in need of reform. The director of this project is Scott Barnett, who you all have just met, a native of Miami with roots that lead back to the Miami of the 1930s, and as a person of Jewish heritage, someone who can understand firsthand the relevance of this shared history. And of course, executive producer Johanna Vega, who you also just heard from, PBS documentary Crossing Overtown, a program that explores the historic narrative of Miami's role in the civil rights movement. So we're going to learn more about that. So, with that being said, I want to, ask you, tell us what inspired, what truly, and I know you just shared a little bit about the two gentlemen you met, Delrish, but for our producers, before they connected with you, what was the main inspiration? I know you like history and filmmaking and documentary, but at this time, this day, what was your inspiration?
Well, the documentary was actually really meant to happen. Back in 2019, we were producing a TV show for PBS, actually, a kids show with author James Patterson. And one of the skits required some sort of jail, but we needed a kid-friendly location to do those scenes. And scouting, we ran into Overtown and the Black Prison Courthouse Museum. And we did film there, but during the production, we got to explore this amazing place, one of the only ones in the entire country, actually. And we were fascinated by the history that we learned just by filming in that location. And from that, we originally planned on making a story about the Black prison. So we met with the board members of the Courthouse Museum, and they led us to several names. One of them was Delrish Moss. So going through all this information and speaking with all these names that we were given, we realized that the story was a little bit more than just that place. And Scott, I have to give a kudos, not only took the time to sit and talk to these people, but he was listening. He took everything in, and he in a moment said, "It's so much information, it's so much rich information. I don't know what to do." And I remember we spoke for several hours and realizing, let's let the story be told by itself. That's all we can do. Turn on the cameras, let the people speak their truth, their story. And that's where we are here now with Crossing Overtown.
Yeah, I think over the years you hear snippets of information from people from the community. Obviously we have great historians who are in the documentary. We have Dr. Marvin Dunn, who's a great Miami historian, and Dr. Fields, who was the founder of the Black Archives. I mean, she's really responsible for helping us hold on to this history. But there's also, the backstory of the police department and what it was like. When people think of Miami today, Miami is a multicultural city with diverse voices. It's an immigrant community. It has a strong history going back to Florida's original, foundations, not just, with the U.S., but even obviously when it was under Spanish territory. But what's interesting about this story, I remember being in the City of Miami Police Department many years ago. I think I was getting a permit for a film production. And I remember seeing pictures on the wall of the officers from, the 1940s and 50s. And, you realize, I kind of always knew this, but Miami, was a part of the South. And it shares, that legacy, and in many cases, unfortunately, shares the legacy of segregation, Jim Crow laws. Obviously, some people don't realize that the Klan had a big influence here, and essentially, the one thing that was very inspirational about this story is that the people who built the railroad, those are the people who started the community. At that time, Overtown was called Colored Town. And what's very interesting is when Miami first started, the community down here was a mix of different people, and it was people from the north. It was Bahamians, which had a huge influence down here, working in the farming communities. But all of these people lived together in some kind of harmony at that time, leading up to the Spanish-American War. And right around at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, that's when you had things like around 1895, Flagler started bringing the railroad down to Miami, and we know that story. And the workers primarily were African American workers who were the laborers who built that railroad. Now, Flagler wasn't down here. He was just down here for a short time. Obviously, he was one of the famous robber barons and extending his railroad for his own profit. But what's important here is the foundation of Miami was literally built with the hands of those first African Americans that were here in Miami. And so for me, this is not a Black story. This is just the history of Miami. And essentially, for me, the people of Overtown and that legacy and where they came from, these are the founding fathers and mothers of Miami. This is how it all began. We would not have Miami if it wasn't for the people who built the foundation of Miami. So that was really the inspiration for the story. And but it would lead later on into, as I was talking about, some of the I don't want to get too much into politics, but one of the things we address in this documentary is, the relevance of the 13, 14, 15 amendments. And during the time of Reconstruction and what was going on with the country, this was a great time period, especially for the formerly enslaved people of the South, where all of a sudden they were starting to get representation. They were going to Congress. Things were changing. But interestingly enough, that's the same time period when a lot of the states in the South started to circumvent those laws with their own laws that would be able to, with in some states we call that the Black Codes, and they put special stipulations on the Black community about what they could or couldn't do. And that's when, Jim Crow really set in, and segregation was became more defined. And I'm just trying to lead to, the Miami of the early 20th century. Unfortunately, the community of Overtown, there were a lot of abuses that happened there. And so ultimately the community was looking for some form of relief. And that's where we get the first 5 patrolmen in 1944. And maybe that's a segue. I'd like to have Delrish tell us about that story, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that story really is a situation where they had a number of situations. I think there was the riots of 23, I want to say, and there was a grand jury report that kind of led to several recommendations, but those recommendations wouldn't come to fruition until 44, when they got 5 black men, trained them in secret, and didn't even bring them into the police department. They swore them in an alleyway near a dentist office, and brought them on. And those men started what became the segregated black police force. They didn't have the power to arrest white people. They couldn't wear their uniforms to court. There were a number of things that they couldn't do, even though they had the full power, or a lot of the powers of police. And they actually led to crime reduction, because a lot of the crimes were actually visited on the black community by, in lots of cases, police officers. They were running prostitutes, they were running gambling operations and all those things. And when those black officers came in, that led to a lot of changes and a feeling of safety and security in the black community. And I had the wonderful opportunity to meet 2 of them, and actually, unfortunately, speak at both their funerals. But I got a chance to meet them and start to learn the history, because it's one thing to you grow up here and you know how things are, but they helped me to see how things came to be. And I think that was very important and a rich part of the inspiration for why I continue in this profession.
Wow, thank you all for sharing inspiration. This is truly, truly profound. And so briefly before, because I want to be able to show our viewers a little snippet, I want to show them the trailer. But before we show the trailer, tell us, PBS, what made them interested in this story from Miami, and how did you get this partnership with PBS?
Well, we previously had a relationship through the kids show, but definitely this story is engaging, is relevant. It is a story that we have such an amount of people in Miami from different backgrounds who are told not only one story, but different versions. There's so many, me as a Latina, I have heard many versions about Overtown, Liberty City, and to educate, which is so important, not to hide history, but actually teach it, learn it from it. That, I think that's what engaged them.
Yeah, we were, I do want to say we were just recently at a conference with American Public Television where they present programming for the upcoming year. And we were hoping that, a few of the stations would be interested in presenting the program, somewhere in the nation. And we were surprised, out of 300 stations or so, we had 240 stations that have committed to showing this documentary. That's how, this film resonates across the country. So that, we have a partnership with South Florida PBS, which is our presenting station. And there will be a broadcast in the spring. The program will begin broadcasting on PBS stations around the country in the spring. So we're really excited about that and get that story out there.
That's amazing. Congratulations. Delrish, you were going to add something?
Well, just talking about the history of Miami and how relevant it is. You think about me growing up here, working here, going to Ferguson. You have Gerald Darling, who worked on the police department, who was one of the officers who trained me, who spent many years after he left Miami in the Memphis school system as the police chief there. And so, I bring these things up because there's so many stories like that where seeds that grew here in Miami are sprouting out across the country and really really relevant to the story of the nation, not just South Florida. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people are so interested in the story here. Even just recently there was a program talking about the fact that Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali, and others were right here making decisions or meeting right here in Miami. And there's so many places where, while the story of Miami is not told, it was so interwoven into the tapestry of American history.
I'd like to add something to that if I can. And one of the things we portray here in this documentary also is Miami. People are very surprised to find out Miami was at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And there's an interesting reason why that was. Because Miami obviously has always been a tourist destination. We have people always coming down from the north to visit the city, right? And it was still a southern town. So it was a mix. It was kind of a mix of the country, really. And what's interesting about that is that, one, some of the earliest protests in the country started in Miami, 1945, Haulover Beach, with the wade-in with church leaders, where they waded into the waters in full dress and suits to stake their claim to the waters. And unfortunately, they did not desegregate the beaches at the time, but that was the key factor in creating Virginia Key Beach as a beach for the African-American population at that time. But also the NAACP and organizations like CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, they came down to Miami to do some of the very first sit-ins in 1959. We're talking about, this is before the 60s, 1959. They were doing sit-ins in Miami at the drugstores in Miami because Miami was the perfect testing ground to see how these non-violent protests were going to work and what were going to be the results of it. So the country was learning from these experiences in Miami, and Miami being at the forefront of it all. So it's one of the unknown stories that fascinates me.
That is very interesting. Well, let's take a look at the trailer to give our viewers a glimpse into what to expect.
I think Miami is really central to a lot of the major racial, social, cultural issues of this country, and it's cutting edge in that respect.
We hope to eliminate racial discrimination in all public accommodations here in the city of Miami.
The laws that we enact that have the tendencies to perpetuate racial inequality is a direct reflection of our values. And at any time, we can begin to make different choices.
Blacks in Miami have had to fight for justice, for freedom from the very beginning. These are resilient people. This is a resilient community, and it's coming back now from the inside out.
So help me God. So help me God.
I think Overtown is an example for the nation, because Overtown did have poverty. It did have a lack of resources. It did have a lack of a proper education. I think one of the things that happens is we forget that we have to look back and kind of make sure that we're helping these communities.
Good to see you.
Hey, man, good to see you. We'll have to have faith that law enforcement and the Black community will one day be able to get along. But believe me, all the way back, there's always been a problem with law enforcement and the Black community.
The cops got all the guns, you can kill them, and it's more Black lives on the line. But what you got to deal with, you're trying to build Miami up, and no tourists are going to sit here.
We are sick and tired of this killing. Understand, we don't mind dying for our rights. If you really asking for justice, leave us alone. Understand, let that Black community be controlled by Black police officers.
Johnson's father said his son was playing a video game when shot by a Miami police officer.
And said, officer, walk in there and turn him around from the machine, put the gun and shot him.
These kinds of things go back, all the way back to the first presence of Blacks in this country and in Florida, from the very first importation of slaves into Florida. And over time, a big debt comes to be paid. And we're looking at that right now, because without Overtown, there would not have been a Miami.
Wow. Yeah, that says just that trailer says a lot, especially with what's going on today, and it brings me to how relevant is this documentary to today, considering not just the political climate, but even the more recent events with the 5 officers that was just sentenced, and that trust for the community, just police and community trust, now regardless of race, but just police and community trust, right? How relevant is this documentary, in your words, and your thoughts, to today?
I want to give that to Delrish.
Well, I think it's very relevant because one of the things that history tells us is what disrespect can do. It tells us what human animus can do. It tells us just how the struggle, even for humanity, has been so ingrained in everything, and those are lessons that we have to learn. We have to look at the history. We have to know the history, not just one side, but we have to know the full history, because the saying goes that if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat those same things. And I never noticed, looking at the clip, and I've looked at that clip countless times, but standing next to Neville Johnson's father was Jeff Hoskins, who is still a friend of mine to this day and is still working with the youth in Overtown. It was very young Jeff Hoskins. That's why I didn't recognize him. We were in high school at that time. But I think that everything that Miami went through kind of before the rest of the community. And that's why when the Rodney King situation happened in LA, a lot of people looked to Miami for lessons. When we started talking about representation in police departments, they looked to Miami for those things. And you get all the way up to Ferguson in 2016, and where did they go for their police chief? They looked to Miami for someone to come and lead that police department and to make those adjustments that needed to be made. And so Miami is very relevant to the story. The lessons that we've learned, the nation can look to and learn from, and we also have to look back at these lessons to remember them, because sometimes we forget where things started and we start repeating those same patterns.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, especially considering, and I'm gonna switch to the political side of it, where, our governor in our state just, banned African-American studies and history in schools and colleges. So you're saying that the history is relevant and needs to be taught, but yet we have people and systems and politicians that are fighting against history. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, being an employee of a state university, I won't go into what I think about what the governor is doing, but I will say this. History is so relevant that I made it a point to teach it in my home. I've made it a point to make it a part of even the lessons as I've led police agencies, because, when you know where you came from, when you know what path, where you are in terms of charting a course. If you don't know where you came from, you don't know really where you're going. And so history is critical to the lessons of the future and of today.
Yeah, Thank you. And I was going to say, Scott, being the historian that you are, what are your thoughts?
Well, it makes me think about when I was at the University of Miami, one of my majors was history. And what was wonderful about that was I was able to get a perspective of different histories, whether it be traditional American history, but also Asian American history. But one of the classes that I took that I had the opportunity was African American history, and that was with Dr. Winnington Johnson, who's one of the great educators at the University of Miami. In fact, he was a pioneer at the University of Miami. And he was always very inspiring. Where am I going to get the information about Marcus Garvey? Where am I going to get the information about Malcolm X? All of these things. This is, again, I keep trying to say, yes, it's African-American history, but it's part of our overall story, and we cannot exclude those things. And, I am not bound to any educational institution, and I am all for the free study of various histories. As a matter of fact, my thesis at the end of my career as studying history at the University of Miami was on Adolf Hitler. Now here I am, a Jewish person, and I'm reading Mein Kampf, trying to understand that story, trying to understand, where that mindset comes from. It's very important that we research, every possibility, every single story. And one thing you learn as a historian is you don't want just one perspective. You want perspective of various people from various backgrounds to get the full story. So it's very important. And we are, honestly, under threat right now of having, the one thing we don't need is governmental authorities telling us what we can or can't teach our kids and learn together as a society. I do want to go back to one thing that's very interesting, and one of the themes of the documentary is the concept of community policing. This is something that Delrish, I'm not going to say he invented the idea of community policing, but he's one of the biggest flag bearers of it. And what's so interesting, talking about history teaching us, if it wasn't for what happened in Miami, in Overtown, to the Black community of Overtown over so many years, we wouldn't have learned to reform those things and to be a better society. So it's very relevant that, when we talk about in the documentary that Overtown teaches us those lessons, it's those underrepresented communities that are teaching us actually how to be better people, how to live in society. And one thing that Miami does now, and Delrish can embellish on it, Miami has community resource officers who are within the community. They are part of the community. They are not there monitoring, looking out for trouble. What they are is they're there to be supportive of the community. And there was a very interesting thing when I was filming the documentary. I was filming at Williams Park in Overtown, one of the public parks there where a lot of kids play sports. And I was filming the one of the teams from the Overtown Optimist League, Tornadoes, the 9-year-olds who play football, and they're in the documentary. And it was interesting, when I was there filming, there were two officers. Actually, it was a woman and a man, and they came to the field. They were not there because they were looking for trouble. They were not there because they heard something was going on and they needed to, find out if they need to rest. They were simply there to be supportive of the community, to show their presence, and to give kids that support that, those officers now in Miami are there to be supportive and help the community. And that's really what's changed a lot. Chief, I wonder if you want to embellish on that idea of community policing and how that helped you in Ferguson.
Well, so community policing, even in Miami, when I was a homicide detective, everybody thought, oh, you're solving cases because you're a brilliant detective. No, I wasn't solving cases because I was a brilliant detective. We weren't preventing murders because I was a brilliant detective. We were doing that because I had a relationship with the community, and the community felt comfortable talking to me and helping me to address these issues. And you speak of the tornadoes in Overtown. One of my last assignments with the Miami Police Department was I ran the Miami Police Athletic League. And the Miami Pal Chiefs is from 5 to 14 football teams, but they also basketball, baseball, softball, dance, all of these things. And these are police officers and volunteers who are the coaches or who are working with these kids. And that's building relationships. And the result of that is when I went to the Miami Police Department to visit recently, a lot of the people who are in charge of the Miami Police Department now, and I'm telling my age at this point, but they were kids that I worked with in the Police Athletic League program and in some of those programs. And so it's really about building relationships, because when I take this uniform off, I'm a guy at the grocery store. I'm a guy at the barbershop. I'm a guy at all these places. And that was one of the things that I took to Ferguson, that whole concept, because when I got to Ferguson, it was kind of a 1970s view of drive-by policing. And actually going door to door and walking and talking with people actually helped to create relationships, which helped me reduce crime, violent crime, by 22% by the time I left there. So community policing is about realizing that we are a part of the community and we don't solve problems on our own. we address problems as a collective, and that helps us to do better, to be safer, and to thrive.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. So I want each of you to quickly think of one takeaway that you would like for those who either come to the premiere or those who watch it from home on PBS. What's the one takeaway that you personally want the viewers to take away from the film? And I'll start with Johanna.
Well, first of all, I consider the information they're gonna receive. Maybe a lot of people are expecting to see a sad story of injustice and pain, and you'll see some of those, but it's a story of resilience. It's actually very inspiring how a community is still holding their ground and keep going. So it's very inspiring, the message in it. And in terms of the why it's important to touch history that we talked before, I just want to say that knowledge is power, and that's something we need to give to our kids. And if they cannot find that information at school, we as parents can give it to them. So that's my message with all this.
Yeah, I speak of opportunity. You know, in this day and age, we talk about equity. And equity means opportunity. And I think one of the things about this documentary, it may help people understand that story, that background story about, where people, wondering why they're maybe in a position that they're in and the challenges that they're facing. But if they begin at a point where they don't have the same opportunities as other people in the community. And this, goes on for generations. And as Dr. Dunn says in the documentary, it's a debt that builds up over time. I think it'll give people a better understanding of where this community is coming from and understanding that, these challenges that they're facing, some of the positions they are in life is because of those challenges, but it also does make them stronger. And the resilience is something that, the people of Overtown, had to work twice as hard as everyone else. And that's why they're able to teach us the lessons that they do.
I think what I want people to take away is that if we work together as a community, we can push through anything. I think one of the things that this documentary does is it reminds you that you stand on the shoulders of giants, really. I got the opportunity to sit down and talk with Chief Dixon, the guy who gave me my badge, and talk about his struggles. And those things really inspired me. And I think that one of the things that people are going to walk away from this, because you think about history and you think about the gloom and doom, but one of the things that this shows is the power of resilience, the power of community, the power of sticking by what you believe in and working to move things forward. And I think we all usually depressed nowadays, especially with social media and all these other things. And I think things like this, documentaries like this, help us see just how possible the future is, or how wonderful the future can be if we imagine it and if we work hard for it and we continue to push forward. If they could do it, then under those conditions, then we can do it under these conditions, which are much better because of them.
Absolutely. Well, one last question. How can those who are tuned in learn more about Crossing Overtown? When is the premiere? How can we get tickets? And then for those who may not be able to attend the premiere because they may not be in Miami, when are they able to tune in to PBS to watch?
Right. Well, if you go to the website, crossingovertown.com, that's the main documentary, but we'll put up a link. There's also if you go to crossingovertown.eventbrite.com, you can find a link for RSVP. This is going to be happening at the Lyric Theater on February 18th in Overtown, where all of this takes place at the historic Lyric Theater that was sitting idle for many years and now is a wonderful gathering place for the community in Overtown. And things are changing there for sure. And there's been a new kind of renaissance in the area. So there's a lot of activities, and it'd be great for people to visit. Oh, and there's the and so the
two screenings, one at midday and one at 4 o'clock. Midday will be a Q&A for those interested in asking questions to the presenters, the speakers on the documentary, and 4 o'clock is just screening only.
All right.
Okay, and this is just a one-day screening.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you have it, everyone. You have 1 day to take advantage of the screening, and 12 o'clock, the panel discussion. 4 o'clock, it'll be screened again. And when will it air on PBS?
Sometime in April. So you need to keep an eye on the listings of the programming on PBS Channel 2.
Okay, awesome. Well, we thank you so much here at Legacy and MIA Media Group for joining us and sharing this documentary, sharing the Crossing Overtown documentary with us, and all that you've shared today about the history of Miami. I think it's so important. I just learned a lot just from having this conversation with you, and I'm sure that I'm going to learn so much more when I have the opportunity to watch the documentary. Please keep us posted on the announcement for the air dates for PBS, so that way we can share it with our viewers, as on our through our newsletter as well, for those who are subscribed to our newsletter. And just stick with me for a quick moment as I do a few brief announcements. I want to thank our sponsors again for making this broadcast possible: the Mesden and Dover Accident Attorneys, AARP, the Florida Lottery, FAMU Mary, and All of Us Research Program at the University of Miami. The Black History Month issue for Legacy magazine is out. You can check it out digitally at miamediagroup.com. That's miamediagrp.com. There are still tickets available for the upcoming Legacy Brunch and Fashion Show, which will take place on February 18th at Le Meridian in Dania Beach. And we're honoring South Florida's most influential women in business and industry. And also, as you just heard, you can check out Crossing Overtown at the historic Lyric Theater in Overtown on the February 18th as well, at 12 noon with a panel discussion, or at 4 p.m. with just a screening. And as always, we have something for everyone, so be sure to check out our other shows. Mondays, we have the Business of Black Business at 1 p.m. with Jay Reynolds. Tuesday, My Money, Your Money at 7 p.m. with Bridgette Lumpkins. Wednesday, Soul at 7 p.m. with Nikki Jellin. Thursdays, with yours truly, Lunch with Legacy Leaders at 12, and Flavor of South Florida at 7 p.m. with Chef Irie, and Health is Wealth. So we can't forget about Black Health Fridays at 2 p.m. with Michelle Kerwin. Be sure to share this video and share it with your network. Please subscribe to all of our channels, follow us, and thank you again to our guests for joining us this afternoon. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again next Thursday at noon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.